So it's wonderful to be here with you today, Aldo and Sandrine. I've been really, really looking forward to this conversation. Of course, you're both highly successful leaders with more than 60 years, can you believe it, experience working, operating in China. And you're the co-authors of the book Dragon Tactics, which I have just coming into screen there, How Chinese Entrepreneurs Thrive in Uncertainty. I've loved reading the book, all of it. It's substantive, it's thoughtful, well-structured, and it's really personal to you. And you're on what can be quite a delicate topic in business and politics. You are constructively critical, even though clearly you admire the Middle Kingdom. Aldo, in terms of your background, you are managing your own China advisory firm now, Dragon Strategies, after completing a role as Executive Vice President, Outdoor and Sports, China's #1 domestic sportswear company. And you've also held senior leadership roles at Fosun Fashion Company, Lacoste, Adidas, and J. Walter Thompson. Wow, what a great portfolio. Sandrine, you are the president of Baozun Brand Management and the president of Baozun Europe. You've also held senior leadership roles in Adidas and Dongjiang before creating your own business in the e-commerce industry, which was acquired by Baozun. So congratulations for that acquisition and all you've done. So today we're going to talk about what leaders, entrepreneurs around the world can learn from their Chinese equivalents. And of course, what businesses can learn from operating in China. What a fabulous and fascinating topic. Welcome to the show, Suzanne and Aldo.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Fantastic, fantastic. So let's talk about the title, because I know reading the book, it was an intentional choice, more so than perhaps other authors, I might say provocatively. So dragon rather than emperor or wolf, as we might come on to, and tactics rather than strategies. Just tell me why you chose Dragon Tactics.
As you said, the words are indeed very consciously chosen. A lot of the Chinese entrepreneurs actually revere wolves because they're very tenacious. They're very great in finding right opportunities. They're great survivors. And that really reflects a lot of the thinking and the attitudes of a lot of those entrepreneurs. The thing is, not all Chinese entrepreneurs are wolves, because wolves also have some negative connotations. And we felt that there is actually more to Chinese entrepreneurs than just wolfism. If you look at historic Chinese data on leadership, dragons are always being referred as benevolent leaders. So the emperor actually took the dragon as a symbol. So a lot of leaders are dragons, and therefore dragons is better than wolves. Where it comes to strategy and tactics, Chinese entrepreneurs actually don't do strategy. That sounds a bit strange,
Wow.
But Chinese entrepreneurs have long-term visions. And on their way to that vision, they're extremely flexible. They can go left one day, right the other day, but they have processes to manage that, as we will explain in the book. So their day-to-day operations are much more tactical rather than strategic. Long-term planning with milestones does not fit in the vocabulary of a Chinese entrepreneur. Hence, Dragon Tactics.
Very good, very articulate. I mean, in some ways, there might be some strategy, but it's very dynamic, very experimental, and lots of choices day to day, going left or right. We often hear of companies around the world who struggle to operate in China. Often we hear of failures more than successes. But I like this show to be optimistic and positive by its spirit and nature. Give me some success stories of companies that have, entered the Chinese market and stayed there and been profitable.
L'Oréal is a great example. Most of the luxury companies are doing very well, and particularly the big luxury groups. So there are indeed also some fashion companies that have done pretty well. So overall, I would say that those who have applied certain dragon tactics, and particularly those who have accepted to adapt to their environment, have been, generally speaking, successful. There are also interesting stories of companies that started differently, like Starbucks, for instance. Starbucks started in a very centralized, American-focused model. And then at some point, they said, we're not growing enough. And really, after 10 years of China, they thought the number of stores they had was absolutely insufficient. And they completely changed their approach. And they decided to actually go China for China and let a lot more autonomy to their local team in order to really make it meaningful for the Chinese market. And this has been successful. So there are, fortunately, quite a number of success stories among the foreign companies.
Well, that's great to hear. And I love that. I guess refreshing to hear organisations like Starbucks actually changing their approach rather than saying, "Oh, we've done it successfully in the US or elsewhere. We'll apply a Chinese version of it." Actually, that doesn't work, as your book articulates very clearly. So you talk about all the things to get right in terms of this, the tactics and the attributes of dragons. If you had to name one source of systemic failure, just one each. Go on, just pick one. I know there's more than one, but one each. What would you point to?
Failing to adapt.
And quite often, failing to adapt comes from a certain level of arrogance, where basically the company would believe that their model has been successful in other parts of the world, and there is no reason why such a great model wouldn't be successful in China. So this failure to adapt comes from the organization, but also comes from the arrogant culture quite often of the company.
I mean, as I said, you've worked in China for decades. You will have spoken with your Western counterparts, read the media in whether it's the US or Europe, and no doubt rolled your eyes from time to time thinking, God, that's not how it works. It really isn't. What would be the biggest business myths that you would call out that we should revisit?
The myths have changed over time. It used to be, and actually we talk about this in the book as well, it used to be, there are 1.3 billion Chinese in China. If we can only capture a fraction of that, we will have a very successful business. Well, part of that myth was correct, the numbers, but in order to capture that even small part required significant change of global strategy, actually doing things very differently. So that was a very clear myth. I think nowadays the myth is different because a lot of people say, well, local competition is winning because they're government supported and there is nationalism in China. Absolutely, there is government support and there's also nationalism, but still a lot of companies are still not doing what it takes in order to be successful. Success in China is possible. There are many examples, but it requires a compromise of global strategy and doing things very differently in a market that is so very differently.
Sandrine, what would you call out as the myths?
Well, I think these are really the key myths, but I want to go back to the second one, which is the fact that a lot of companies misread the success of local companies. Again, they only attribute this success to support from the government. And one thing they don't realize is how much these local companies have evolved over time and how much their products and what they offer to the consumers today have become not only good quality, but spot on what is desired by local consumers. And I think this is one of the myths combined with a lot of difficulties.
I want to go back to some topics we've covered already in what is a brilliant conversation. I'm loving it. Around the emperor and agility. And I love paradoxes more so than trade-offs. And you say in your book, the emperor decides, but agility rules. Just unpack that, what for some of us would feel like a paradox or perhaps a trade-off.
Yeah, well, it is a paradox, but this kind of paradox is typical of what we call Chinese dialectics. And in fact, it is true that there is a very long tradition in country governance, but has also infused company governance in China, a long tradition of a very strong leader, which used to be an emperor, and today is a kind of emperor nowadays, if I look at it from a political point of view. And we have this model quite often replicated in companies, where the big boss is an arch leader who makes a lot of decisions. Now, I would say that paradoxically, on the surface only, this actually brings more agility than we think. And number one, because it shortens the decision process. So that's the first reason why it's more agile. But I would say also because there are two ingredients that are mixed together with this emperorship, if I may say. Number one, a lot of decentralization. And again, this is actually mirrored in the organization of China as a country. You've got a very, very strong central government, but at the same time, each province has a lot of leeway. For instance, the way there is a guideline, I would say, for taxes, but within these guidelines, each local government may decide to do some slightly different things. So this decentralization is absolutely compatible with very strong central power, paradoxically as it may seem. The second big ingredient that I'd like to mention is actually the fact that in companies, the leader, who is indeed a kind of emperor, would break the pyramid. And the pyramid is not something they would religiously respect. In fact, the arch leader would very willingly go to the bottom of the pyramid to get as close as possible to the field, talk to people who are in the execution, a lot more than what I have seen in any global or multinational company.
Yes. I love that. I've heard, if you like, going right to the shop floor or the factory floor, sleeping with some of the staff if they're doing night shifts, or whatever they're doing. That's fascinating. So, I mean, linked to that, obviously we do lots of examples of innovation, particularly technology-driven innovation in ecosystems, which is one of the aspects you cover in the book. But you talk about it being innovation that's more incremental, that's transformational. And I was, again, struggling to work out, on the one hand, the Chinese economy and business has grown and been very successful in the aggregate. And you talk about China being a continent as much as, if you like, a country. At the same time, I was thinking, gosh, do they not need to be good at transformational innovation, not just incremental? Just tell me, unpack that, the balance between the two, transformational versus incremental innovation in the companies that you know and you worked in.
The Chinese are definitely experts at incremental innovation. This has a few causes. One, I think historically there was never that much focus on transformational innovation because when the country is opening up, they had to look abroad and they looked at things they could find, but they thought we need to adapt this and improve this for our local market. So that was one reason why they started with incremental innovation. At the same time, and this was one of the frustrations that both Sandrine and I had when we worked for local companies, everything is KPI'd. And for one of the companies, I was actually involved in developing KPIs for innovation. And I would say, well, let's build an entire department and let's KPI the fact that we built the department. But no, everything had to be brought back to actual sales.
Wow. So
they're so results driven, even when it comes to innovation. But when you want to do transformational innovation, who knows? That's blue sky. That may take years, but that you cannot KPI. So they're more comfortable with setting more short-term targets, and that automatically leads to incremental innovation. So I think for us, the jury is very much out longer term where that goes. I do think they have the creative capabilities for sure. They have the universities for sure. So I am convinced that ultimately they will also be good at transformational innovation. But at the moment, it is still very much building step for step.
I just want to add one word or two on this, that in general, what we can see is that they are not so attracted by concept. They're much more pragmatic, and they're very attracted by what is practical and relates to execution and has some true visibility on the field or in the field. And this also goes along with the fact that there is much less transformation than incremental innovations.
Yes, that's such a good point. I'm fascinated what that means for, if you like, culture, organizational culture then, because the picture you're painting in general terms is one of a highly dynamic, experimental, change-driven organization, people hands-on, very practical. That sounds demanding and exhausting. And I wonder how sustainable that is at an organizational level. Most organizations need time to breathe from time to time, to reflect, to recharge and so on. What are your own experiences and reflections on that?
Well, this is where wolf culture comes in. Chinese companies, a lot of companies like wolf culture. At Anta, for example, we used to call it the Iron Army. The word wolf culture was actually coined within Hire. So yes, there is a notion of wanting to work hard. And Sandrine and I talk a lot about this. We are missing this in Europe these days. I think we've lost a little bit of the edge. And don't get me wrong, I'm not. We are not big proponents of the work from 9 to 9 every day, 6 days a week. The so-called Jojo Liu, the 996. That is quite common in China. That is not necessarily the right approach. But I do think Chinese workers, staff, especially young staff, they still have an eagerness to prove themselves and to do better. There's this big notion within Chinese culture that your generation needs to do better than your previous generation. Brilliant. And I think this brings a lot of commitment and a lot of attitude to wanting to be successful. Ultimately, I think there's a lot of good in there. And in the book also we talk about how can you harness this part of what wolf culture actually really brings to an organization.
I love that. That sounds more hunger, more focus, perhaps more intensity, rather than just working 6-7 days a week, 12 hours, 14 hours a day. And is that relates to your point in the book that you say that people come and go, but the right people stay and contribute. Does that also mean a ruthlessness about if you're not delivering the results, people go, i.e. they leave? Is that a consequence?
Absolutely. This is exactly what is happening. But there is another element that comes and sometimes contradict this one, is trust. Because Chinese people, or China in general, is a low trust culture. The trust, when you found someone that you trust, when the big leader finds someone that he or she trusts, he will forgive to some extent some performance issues, as long as he or she can rely on this person. But that only concerns a few people around him or her. The rest is going to be very performance driven, yes, and come and go.
And also, what is the real difference in this respect also is that Chinese entrepreneurs are looking for other entrepreneurs. In the West, it is easy to hide yourself behind layers of bureaucracy. That visibility is, or that lack of visibility, I should say, is impossible in a Chinese company. There is this great openness to everyone that you need to contribute, and if you don't, and they will lean on you to move on or to change positions. So as long as you can contribute in an entrepreneurial way to the organization, you're feeling very much awarded. And I think that's a fundamental difference with a Western organization where, from our experience, quite often, real entrepreneurial employees will not stay because very often they're not given enough room to really express entrepreneurial behavior and entrepreneurial drive. And I think that is why people in the West would leave. That is why people in Chinese companies would stay.
I think it's also important to bring a little bit of a nuance in what we say. Not everything is good about this. It is indeed exhausting, and you need to have supermen, I would say, at the helm to bear this incredible intensity of work. That's number one. So, of course, it's a very large population. So at the end of the day, you can always find a few supermen. But there is also, with growth being less dynamic than it used to be, there is also in China full realization that now we need to go towards more efficiency and not just a huge work.
I get that. I mean, one of the case studies that we hear, read, listen to is Hire. It's an organization that seems to be on every platform, every conference stage as a model of, I guess, entrepreneurialism, decentralization, autonomy. I'm curious if as you're operating in China, who are the other organizations that people say, wow, that's the ones we really need to learn from because of their, not only their performance, but their management approach as well? Give us some names. Go on.
So the hire model is very interesting, and we're following that. But of course, the jury is still out because what they did is quite extreme by literally cutting up their company in lots of smaller cells, where even within HR departments there is no department anymore, but we have cells that compete with each other. One company that we look a lot at is a company called Xiaomi. Fascinating company when it comes to both organizational but also consumer focus. Organizational, until they had 15,000 people. They had 3 layers of management. They had the CEO, under him, the other co-founders, and then everybody else. 15,000 people, 3 layers. It works because they work in projects, but not in departments. In all fairness, they realized when they were getting so big that they did need a finance department and they did need supply chain capability. So they have some form of organization today. But even within a slightly more organized platform, they still are extremely ecosystem driven and work with capabilities rather than within departments. I think another company also interesting to look at is, of course, Alibaba. Sandrine and I are real believers in the need for organizing in an ecosystem, in a much more digital, much more agile world. And Alibaba is, of course, a tremendous example of that. Everybody now talks about the fact that they're going to split themselves in 6 parts, but actually they were already hundreds of parts, because Alibaba is not really a company. It is an ecosystem of literally hundreds of companies that are all cross-invested, that have similar use of systems, that use similar corporate culture, that use the same campus, etc. So I think this whole agile organization is very interesting. I want to a little bit go back to Xiaomi, because Xiaomi also has a phenomenal model to be consumer focused, where literally everyone in the company, in their contract, agree to be a customer service rep. Mm-hmm. So they have a system that if there are customer complaints or customer feedback, it will be routed to people randomly in the company, including the CEO. And that means that everyone is regularly exposed to what is really happening in the market. In the West, a lot of companies talk about consumer focus. They do the occasional focus group. But in China, they literally live constant consumer
it's in the
focus.
contract, in their contract.
Yeah.
It's even in their contracts, yes.
Yeah, no, and I want to really stress the fact that most of the big entrepreneurs or the big companies, entrepreneurs in China have devoted particular energy and thinking around how to manage people, how to organize people in a way that brings the best out of them and the best out of the company. It's something that we don't really see in the West. We believe that these are very big companies with extremely authoritarian management. There is a lot more to this. All the examples we have mentioned, and there are many, many others, are really of people, be Jack Ma, Pony Ma, Zhen Zhenfei. I mean, all of them have really spent a lot of energy on thinking, how can I really be innovative in the way I manage people?
And how do they, that mindset and that practice you just articulated, how do they scale that beyond role modeling, which is important, beyond putting it in the contract? Because that's something that I know Western leaders struggle with. They have the innovation unit, they talk about customer or consumer centricity, et cetera, but it often only lives in pockets of an organization. The success stories you've talked about clearly do that at scale. So what are they doing to take that and infusing it in the organization?
I think, I mean, maybe I just say a few words, then I leave it to you, Aldo. But I think to start with, they care a lot about the culture. So the big boss is very involved in this. And he brings the word to his team and to this entire organization. It's not something he would leave to the marketing team or he would leave to the HR team. It's his idea. And it's his idea, and he embodies his idea, and he's going to communicate his vision and to the entire team. So this really makes a huge difference. The other thing is that, as Aldo was saying, they KPI everything. So they would actually do this and then KPI it. And the third thing, which I think is also interesting, is their practice of brainstorming. We tend to think of brainstorming in Western companies as sessions to really bring out the creativity of people. It's quite different in China. In China, and I'm still experiencing this almost on a daily basis with Baozun, like any minute you can have the big boss who calls that person from the middle level, the high level, even the very, very basic level to say, there is an issue I heard about. Let's see how we can resolve it. And this really brings things to life in the execution.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And there is even a cultural difference. In China, in the West, a thinker is highly revered. In China, an observer is highly revered. So the notion of observing what happens around you and be in constant connection with the here and now, that is an ingrained behavior. So people automatically ask a lot of questions. There is a lot of interest and need for learning. If you want to be informed about consumers, all you need to do is ask people around you, because everyone is working on that. To an extent that for a Westerner like us, sometimes we say, oh, there's another trend that they want to follow. Let's just put things on hold a little bit, because they're constantly looking for the new, because they're constantly looking for opportunities, as we described very much, which is the notion of wolf culture. Yes. The wolf is always on the lookout for an opportunity. And that is ingrained behavior in a lot of the organizations. So automatically that is being scaled.
I'd love to just pivot for a moment, because you're both highly experienced. I sense you've got strong characters, which is fantastic. It's a compliment, by the way. What was the biggest source of disagreement when you wrote this book?
I don't think
we had many disagreements.
Even on
Wonderful.
This.
So Sandrine and I have known each other for a very long time, and we've worked in several capabilities with each other. So we seem to be thinking similar on many topics. As we said in the pre-talk, we don't agree on everything, but I think on the book, quite a lot of things we relatively quickly agreed on. Sandrine, I don't know anything to add to that?
I don't remember any particular theme or point on which we had different views. Maybe different views on how to express it, which example to use to illustrate, but really on what we have observed in this market, we are very much in sync.
So if you were speaking to a CEO or a C-suite executive, a global organization that has some operational footprint in China, but is doing okay, not, it wants to go from okay to great, what one single thing would you tell her or him?
It's, we discussed a little bit in the book about a concept that has been coined by a guy called James Allen, and who is from Bain, and which is really the engine 1, engine 2, saying that your engine 1 is your home company, so it's either US or Europe, but you need to really treat your China as your engine 2, and you need to have a different setup for your engine 2, because it's a different scale, it's different growth. And progressively, your engine 2 will actually give you lessons on how to modify your engine 1.
Yes,
and
yes.
I think this is actually a great concept. And those who have succeeded have really followed this line, which is, let's not try to do the same, but let's become Chinese in the sense that we observe what's going on around us. When you arrive in China, look at it. Look at it. Don't bring your idea. Look at what you have under your eyes. And then build your engine 2 by really doing China for China, rather than trying to impose your home model. I think this is essential. And the second thing is, make sure that what you offer to consumers is something they need and they want. So you need to really challenge yourself on this, because some companies, they took it for granted, but it's not.
Great.
I think that is one extra point, and what I want to add to this, and that is adaptability. Go to China with a consistent mindset, and not just go to China. This is also behavior increasingly needed in the West, in what is increasingly a more uncertain world as well, is consistent adaptation. This is where the Chinese are masters. Western companies do not sacrifice often enough things like global strategy. They often do not move quickly enough if the world is changing. For a myriad of reasons, I understand, but if you are a CEO and you need to be successful in this sort of environment, you have no choice but to consistently adapt.
And to also ongoingly adapt. I think I want to also insist on this, because a company like Carrefour, for instance, Carrefour succeeded at the beginning. And then because they succeeded, they thought, okay, we've got it, we've got the recipe, it works. And in fact, a few years later, they woke up and realized it doesn't work.
Yes.
And in a completely different category, very interesting to look at what is happening in the fragrance and perfume market, which is now exploded in China. At the beginning, we had, and it was true, consumers were new to this, so they wanted certain types of scents, more lemony, more floral, not too heavy. And people started to say, okay, let's go for this full speed. But they forgot to observe that consumers change so fast. Now they've gone a completely different direction. So some of the key players who were really at the forefront of the market only a few years ago are now actually losing it because they did not adapt sufficiently.
Very good. In the spirit of agility, I want to just move to a close and focus on you both, as I always do on Lance Who Are on the Line podcast. Mm-hmm. What's been the biggest gift, in a nutshell, that working in China has given you, both of you? Aldo, perhaps you can start.
Growth and excitement. In China, there was always something that could be done new. When I look at my own career, I thought a few times to go back, but then I looked around and thought we have 8,000 stores here in China. I can go back to Europe and I have a few hundred. So the excitement of building things, creating things. If you look at what has been possible over the last 20, 30 years in China, that was unrivaled anywhere else in the world. And even although there's a lot of geopolitical talk today, but it's a lot more negative, I think a lot of that excitement is still there and is still possible. So being able to think entrepreneurial, behave entrepreneurial, that is really something that I've really treasured over my years being in China.
Sandrine?
Well, of course, I share what Aldo said completely, but I think I would also say that to have had the chance to be in a position to see something totally different from what we had learned and to see that still it works. It's not what we had learned. It's not what we had been taught. It's a completely different way. There are people, they're doing business, they are selling stuff, and yet the way they are doing it is so different. And this is fascinating. And that really forces you to challenge yourself and challenge everything you have learned before. And this is a real gift.
Absolutely. And when you're having your absolutely best possible day, when you're on your peak form, you're absolutely smashing it, what are the mindsets and practices you employ?
I guess adaptability.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that's a theme here.
Think in the here and now. The world changes. It changes fast. You need to be ready for this change. In the West, we talk too much about you need to shut out the noise. You need to focus. We have come to learn that to a certain extent is not bad, but it also, especially in what is increasingly an uncertain world, that can also mean you miss out on opportunities.
How do you, on the agility point, adaptability, how do you avoid it tipping over into anxiety? Because for many people, they enjoy it for moments, and then after a while, it's like chronic. It becomes chronic, and it's like, wow, there's a latency around the anxiety. How do you manage it so you actually thrive on it, but actually it doesn't turn the other way where you'll become literally on edge?
I guess it's also a question of personality. Actually, I love change. So it doesn't bring anxiety to me. So I guess it's really teaching people how to embrace change is really the key thing, because we have to. We are in such an uncertain world today that we can't get stuck where we are. There's no way it would work.
Mm-hmm.
And I could only agree with that. Some of the best parts of my career were transformations, were turnarounds. There's lots of problems, but you need to basically think on your feet. You need to move quick, dealing with growth. So I guess I relish uncertainty and feel happy in it.
Great. And Sandrine, any mindsets or habits you'd draw out for the audience?
Yeah, I would say that in a very personal way, one of the things I learned among many, but that I really try very consciously to apply, is the 80-20 rule. I think, again, we have been, and a lot of things very, very good in what we have been educated about, but at least there is potentially we have been too focused on perfectionism and on doing things to the full and very, very well, etc. And I'm not saying we should not do things well, but in fact, I really learned from Chinese entrepreneurs and my Chinese friends and co-workers that a lot of times when you do 80%, it's enough. The last 20% is going to be a loss of time. And when I really feel I had a great day is when I really knew when to stop at 80 instead of using my time on the last 20.
Fantastic. And on that theme, I'll take it as a segue into bringing this brilliant conversation to a close. It's been uplifting, it's been stimulating, it's been insightful. You've countered some myths, you've brought some new insights and ideas for people. Absolutely fabulous. Where can people and listeners find out more about the book and, of course, your work? Tell us where online.
Amazon is the easiest. That is global. And also on dragontactics.com, you can find more information.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes in the series. Sign up to the YouTube channel, to the podcast. Give me a lovely rating. Aldo, Sandrine, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David, for having us.